Section 3.7, relating fractions, decimals, and percents. Fractions, decimals, and percents, or percentages, are all relative to each other. You can have a fraction and a decimal and a percentage, and they can all be telling you the same thing. They're just shown in different ways. So I used 25 out of 100 or 25% for this one because it's a fairly easy one to use. So I'm going to use that as my demonstration. So 25 over 100 is kind of like, let's say that you took a test or you had a quiz with 100 questions on it and you got 25 of them right. You would have got 25 out of 100. So 25 hundredths. To write that fraction as a decimal, it's written as 25 hundredths. You write 25 after the decimal, ending in the hundredths category. And of course, 25 out of 100 on a test is 25%. If you take your hundredths, percentage is often out of 100, so whatever your decimal is, if you multiply it by 100, you get 25%. 25 hundredths multiplied by 100 is 25%. And again, those interchange over here, like I've shown. 25% is the same thing as 25 out of 100, which is 25 hundredths. And if I started with 25 hundredths, multiplying by 100 would give me 25%, and 25% and 25 hundredths is the same as 25 over 100. So they're interchangeable between the three. You should be able to take any fraction and make a decimal and a percent. You should be able to take any decimal and make a fraction and a percent, and you should be able to take any percent and make a decimal or a fraction out of it. So let's take a look at how to do that. I chose something another one that's fairly straightforward and easy to use. 2/5, so which is 2 over 5. We're going to use the technique of changing the fraction to have a denominator out of a 10, 100, or 1,000, because those tend to be easier to put into decimals because the place values are tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. So to put 2 over 5 so it's out of 10 or into tenths, we have to find the number that we need to multiply by 5 to make 10, which is 2. 5 times 2 would be 10. So if we have times 2 on the bottom, we have to multiply by 2 on the top. 5 times 2 is 10, and 2 times 2 is 4. So we have 4 tenths. And as we've talked about before, 2/5 and 4 tenths are equivalent fractions. They're not equal, they're not the same, but they are equivalent. They mean the same thing. And 4 tenths, again, written as a decimal, is written as 4 tenths. And to change that 4 tenths into a percentage, we multiply by 100. Well, 4 tenths times 100 is 40%. So you'll see that 2/5 became 4 tenths, and then that 4 tenths multiplied by 100 equaled 40%. So your fraction was 2.5, which is 0.4, which is 40%. Now there is an easier way to do that, and we've done it a little bit, changing fractions to decimals. If you divide the top number by the bottom number, you'll see that it's 0.4, just like we got there. And then if you multiply that by 100, it's 40%. So 2 divided by 5 was 0.4, multiply it by 100, gives you 40%. Let's take a look at a little bit more difficult fraction. It's not necessarily more difficult, it's just a little bit different. Let's look at 7 over 20. And again, same idea. This time we're going to go up into changing it to hundredths in the fraction form, because again, tenths, hundredths, and thousandths are easier to use. So we need to look at our denominator. It's 20. We need to think about how we can make 20 into 100. Well, that would be times 5. So 20 times 5, and whatever we multiply the bottom by, we have to multiply the top by. So if 20 times 5 is 100, then that means that 7 times 5 is 35. So 7 over 20 is equivalent to 35 over 100, which means that the decimal would be 35 hundredths. 35 out of 100 is 35 hundredths. And to take that decimal and make it into a fraction, we multiply by 100, and 35 hundredths times 100 is 35%. So 7 over 20 is the same as 35 hundredths, which is the same as 35%. And again, like we said before, if you want to do a little bit more of an express way, you can divide the top, which is 7, divided by the bottom, which was 20, And you'll see that that gives you 35 hundredths, just like we had up above. And if we take that 35 hundredths and we multiply it by 100, that gives us, the same as above, 35%. So it's just two different techniques, taking a fraction, making it into an equivalent fraction, into a decimal or a percentage, or doing the division of a fraction to a decimal multiplied by 100 to a percentage. If you were given 35 hundredths, you could change that into a fraction and into a percentage, and vice versa for the 3. So your practice questions, I do have 2 for you for this section. I want you to write each fraction as a percentage and a decimal. So you can use either technique if you like. You can go back and do the equivalent fraction to a decimal to a percentage, or you can just take your fraction, make it into a decimal the express way, and then change that decimal into a percent. Okay, so your 2 fractions that I want you to deal with are 3 over 7 and 12 over 23. Make both of those fractions into percentages and into decimals.